Hi there. In this video, part one of a three-part series, I'll be discussing the major events in evolution on Earth. Some of these will be physical, some chemical, and then some biological as well. So the first thing I want to discuss is just to try and set up an approximate timeline so you can get an idea of when these things were happening on Earth, especially some of the more things that were in the distant past that took place on Earth. So some of the major questions to keep in mind while I'm going through this is when did life begin on Earth? When did eukaryotes first appear? When did the dinosaurs go extinct, and when did they appear? And then when did the first humans appear, as well as when did the first hominins occur, our human-like ancestors. So here's a timeline, and I've broken it up so that it can be put on a single page. Often when I do this in class, I have a timeline taped up in the front of the room and then have little tags where people can put these various events to try and see how much they know about evolution and how much they don't know about evolution. But anyway, I'll present this just as a few facts anyway in this case. So the Earth formed, and the solar system formed about 4.55 billion years ago, and the Moon formed about 20 million years after that by a collision with a Mars-sized body, another planet. So much of the surface had solidified by 4.4 billion, and then there were oceans present by about 4.3 billion years ago, and right at the beginning there were no continents. Everything was covered in water. By about 4.2 to 4.1 billion years ago, there were then RNA-based organisms, and about 3.8 billion years ago, the first bacteria were present, and they were based on DNA by this time, as are bacteria today. Then Archaea probably appeared around 3 billion years ago, and they had some major changes. Major evolution had gone on between the bacterial ancestors and the Archaea, so they were more advanced essentially. Oxygenation of the atmosphere started occurring around 2.7 billion years ago due to oxygenic photosynthesis by cyanobacteria. And then by 2.3 to 2.4 billion years ago, you had the first eukaryotes, including the first eukaryotes with mitochondria. About 1.9 billion years ago, then that's when cyanobacteria entered a eukaryotic protists, and those became photosynthetic organisms that we call plants, or Archaeplastida. Red algae first, and then green algae much later, about 1.2 billion years ago, and that 1.2 billion coincides with the first fungi that appeared on Earth. By 1 billion years ago, there were definitely multicellular organisms on Earth, and some estimates put multicellularity way back around 2 billion years ago, the first multicellular organism. So there's some disagreement in that. At about 600 to 800 million years ago, the entire Earth was covered in ice and snow all the way to the equator, including the oceans. Some of the oceans were covered by a mile-thick layer of ice, so it was a very different time. When we came out of that snowball Earth time, then there was an expansion of the number of organisms on Earth, including multicellular organisms, animals, fish, land plants, amphibians, insects, reptiles, and then dinosaurs around 250 million years ago. Birds originated around the same time, and then mammals around 210 million years ago. And then by 65 million years ago, dinosaurs had gone extinct due to a huge meteor that hit near Chicxulub, Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula, and wiped out about 75% of the species of organisms at that time. But while the dinosaurs went extinct, many reptile species related to dinosaurs and birds that are also related to dinosaurs, they survived. About 60 million years ago, then you start seeing primates. 7 million years ago, hominins, and then the genus Homo about 2.5 million years ago, and then finally us around 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens. You can see these last labels are kind of scrunched together here because they can't really thoroughly be put onto this time scale because they're all right at the very tip of that line. And remember from the last video, I was talking about the time between the Big Bang down here on the lower left, going through production of stars and then galaxies, and then the formation of our solar system, which began around 9 billion years ago, and then the solar system, including the Earth, cooled enough so that 4.55 billion years ago, the planets, including the Earth, had cooled enough and accreted enough of their mass to be recognizable as planets circling the sun. So here I have another timeline, and you can see starting 4.55 billion years ago with the formation of the Earth, a lot of chemical evolution going on early on, as well as chemicals being delivered by meteors and comets and things like that. And then biological evolution starting around 4.2 billion years going to the present. So here at the beginning we have the formation of the Earth about 4.55 billion years ago. It was still fairly molten all the way through at that time. And then shortly afterwards, probably between 4.3 and 4.5 billion years ago, depending on different estimates, the Earth was struck by a Mars-sized body, essentially another planet that may have been in the same orbit as the Earth, and pretty much obliterated any solid material that was on Earth at that time. So anything that had solidified was then melted again at this time. So here are some artists' depictions of those. So in the top left, you can see the relative size between the Earth at that time and then this Mars-sized body that hit the Earth. Now this shows it hitting pretty much dead on, but it's clear that it hit sort of at an oblique angle. If it hit straight on, then the Earth might not exist today. And you can see that as it hit and struck, there was a lot of friction and a lot of energy released, and the entire Earth was molten rock again at that time. And as you can see on the right-hand side, that this spewed out huge amounts of molten material away from the Earth. And it took with it, a lot of that material was from the Earth's mantle that had been starting to form at that time. And so that ripped away those upper layers that were on the Earth, and that's what became the moon. So those eventually started to cool and accrete into the moon, although initially there was more than one moon. There were probably at least two moons and some then tiny little moons, that some of which still exist and are circulating around the Earth. This diagram shows a simulation of what probably happened, and you can see from this top left that it hit at an oblique angle to the Earth. And then you can see after 10 minutes, this is what it looked like, and things were heating up between the Earth and that Mars-sized body. Eventually, after a little over an hour, huge amounts of debris were ejected from the Earth, and then a couple of hours later, those started to accrete into the moon, and you can see the Earth again is completely molten at that time. So this illustrates some of these very violent things that occur within the solar system and the galaxy and the universe as well. As it turned out, it was a good thing that this happened to the Earth, because it led to some very important things that helped aid life on Earth millions and billions of years later. The moon today that we see up in the sky is not uniform, so that one side of it is in lower elevation than the other. So all of the huge mountains are all on one side of the moon. And so it's been hypothesized, and actually some models, computer models, have shown that it's very possible that initially there were two large bodies, two moons, that were circulating around the Earth. And these then eventually were in the same orbit and then came together in kind of a slow motion effect, where the smaller moon struck the larger moon and then slowly melted into it, so that today that moon has highlands localized on one half of the moon, where all of the lowlands are on the other side of the moon. So from about 4.3 to 4.5 billion years to about 4 billion years, the Earth looks somewhat like this for at least part of the time. You can see that the moon was much closer, so it exerted much more gravitational pull on the Earth, so that the tides, both in molten pools such as this, but there were also oceans present by 4.3 billion years ago, that the tides were much more extreme. You had extreme high tides and extreme low tides. And also the moon was pulling on the Earth, so it was also pulling on the Earth's crust and causing more volcanism as well. So there were many volcanoes, huge volcanic eruptions at that time, and cracks in the crust. Also, the day length was about 6 hours, because the Earth was spinning faster than it is today. Today it spins, once every 24 point something hours. At that time, the day lengths were about 6 hours in length. That is for a day-night cycle. So from the very first parts of formation of the Earth to a little bit under 4 billion years ago, and probably continuing today, there wasn't any biological evolution going on until about 4.2 billion years ago, but there still was chemical evolution. So you had amino acids and nucleic acids, things like that, arriving from meteors and from comets, and there were some coming out of volcanoes. Different compounds were coming out of volcanoes, and there was water present, oceans present, high pressures at the bottom of the ocean, and ocean vents. So a lot of chemical reactions were going on to form many different compounds. Some of those compounds became important to biological organisms. Not all of them, of course, but many of them became very important to formation of the initial organisms on Earth. So these building block molecules here were some of the first ones to be on Earth, and I talked about these in one of the first two videos on the fact that many of these amino acids, nucleic acids, purines, fatty acids, hydrocarbons that led to carbohydrates, and many of those other compounds and basic building blocks were present on early Earth. And then you have energy and catalysis, and some of these could join into larger and larger molecules. including RNA. In some cases, we know that RNA can be produced de novo in some cases into longer chains, and amino acids can be joined into peptides by non-biological means as well. Then some of those molecules became capable, or at least some of them spontaneously self-assembled into larger assemblages. And a few of those could actually self-replicate. And we know that some molecules, some short RNA sequences can actually, in a test tube, replicate themselves. Not all of them, but all you need are a few to start out this whole system of becoming more and more complex. So you have this self-assembly and self-replication of certain molecules that could become then biological molecules. This could then start off a process where with the fatty acids, that is phospholipids in some cases, could start forming these self-enveloped systems with these self-replicating molecules inside. And that could become the first organism, and we are pretty sure that those first organisms were based on peptides, fatty acids, some carbohydrates, and RNA, but not DNA at the beginning. So by as early as about 4.3 billion years ago, the chemical building blocks were there. There were amino acids, nucleic acids, fatty acids, probably phospholipids, carbohydrates that were available in the environment. There was a lot of water. There were oceans, probably more fresh water. They weren't salty yet. And that water came from comets and volcanoes primarily. There were energy sources, both solar heat and electrical energy, that is lightning. And then there was a lot of time, at least several 100 million years. Catalysts also probably played an important part, and these are, some metals are catalysts for certain reactions that were important to development of living systems. And then there were selective pressures, many zones, which would lead to encouraging, at least eventually, these self-replicating organisms that became biological organisms that we know today. But by selective pressures, I mean that there were a lot of different things going on, many different reactions, many things happening. Most of those, the vast majority, were unsuccessful at creating any sort of biological system. And it was only a very, very tiny number that were successful in surviving and self-replicating and replicating their RNA, so that by and large, most things that started out you can think of as going extinct, and a very, very minuscule number of reactions and systems became what we now have as biological systems, otherwise known as cells. So remember, in a previous video I was talking about the Miller-Urey experiments, and where they introduced hydrogen gas, methane, ammonia, and some other things into a closed system that also had hot water, which was simulating an ocean, and then electrical discharges over here simulating lightning, a condenser here to cool those gases into liquids. And they came out with finding many, many different types of amino acids, including eventually 10 of those that are important biologically. Here is the apparatus they actually used, and it was mainly done by Stanley Miller, who was a graduate student at the time, about 24 years old when he did these experiments. There's the electrodes with the simulating lightning. Here's the simulated ocean, and then where they were inserting the gases here and drawing out the products from those experiments, a series of experiments, really. So from those experiments, they found amino acids, including several, 10 of them actually, that are found in proteins today. And they found some other compounds that are found in biological systems. By the way, they found a lot of other compounds that aren't used in biological systems. So they found a lot of other things as well. Subsequent to their experiments, others also simulated other types of apparatus, not exactly the Miller-Urey as shown here, but they added simple carbon and nitrogen containing compounds as gases in here, and then pulled out products in the end, and eventually found up to 16 of the amino acids could be produced abiotically in these different systems. Additionally, when you leave some of these experiments in the cold and freezing, some of the other amino acids are more prevalent also. So they're not only the heat caused some of these amino acids to form, but heat followed by cold or just cold also produced some of the other amino acids. And then there were other experiments done where they could actually form nucleic acid precursors abiotically, that is, without any biological help. So abiotically, at least 16 of the 20 amino acids found in proteins can be produced, although those 10 that I mentioned last time are in the highest concentrations, and those can be produced abiotically, and they're also found in meteorites, whereas these other 6 are not. Also, you can produce nucleic acid precursors and other compounds, and some of these other things are also found in meteorites and comets. So here's a meteor streaking through the atmosphere, burning up somewhat as it passes either through or into, or actually strikes the Earth. And in doing so, it's heating up, there's pressure, and you can actually get peptides, short peptides formed from joining together of the amino acids that are contained within in that rock. And this is the head of a comet, and you can see that there's this blowout of this material, primarily consisting of water and granules from the comet itself. And all of that also contains probably things that are precursors to biological evolution also. And there was early on a heavy bombardment on the Earth of comets and meteors, bringing in a lot of different compounds, including amino acids and nucleic acid precursors, and also a great deal of water. This likely occurred on other planets as well, including Mars, although the conditions on Earth made it such that the water was retained on the Earth, and so the atmosphere became a very important part of protecting the surface of the Earth for biological evolution. So this is just one of the meteorites that's been examined, the famous Murchison meteorite. And so you can see amino acids, aromatic hydrocarbons, and aliphatic hydrocarbons, fullerenes, or carboxylic acids, purines, pyrimidines. So a lot of the precursors for developing biological systems are present in these meteorites. And this is not the only one that's been examined. So there have been several of these that have been examined that contain similar compounds. In fact, in some of these, more than 100 different amino acids have been found, 10 of which are those biologically useful ones, but many, many different amino acids have been found. Nucleic acid precursors, including purines and pyrimidines, have been found, and then a lot of water, not only in comets, but also in meteorites. And as I indicated, when you have amino acids and you add heat and pressure, including asteroids going through the atmosphere, there's a lot of pressure, a lot of heat, they can form short peptides, form peptide bonds between them. So not only can these asteroids, meteorites, and comets, if they strike the Earth, bring in amino acids, but they can also, there's a possibility that they can already have some peptides, small, short peptides that have been formed within those bolides. So after all of these things arrived on Earth, they were available on Earth, where did life begin? And originally people said, well, it was in these soupy ponds at the surface. But there was so much UV irradiation and cosmic rays coming and hitting the Earth that probably would have sterilized anything or killed anything that was at the surface. More recent theories place the origin in thermal vents on the ocean floor. This would have protected any biological materials, DNA, RNA, proteins, from the UV irradiation at the surface. Also, there was enough heat down there, and there's actually, because of glowing rocks and things like that from volcanic activity, there's a little light, there's red light down there, so they could actually do photosynthesis, and we actually know of some organisms that are photosynthetic that are at the bottom of the ocean, and they usually rely on the red light from glowing volcanic rocks. There are also many different compounds coming out of these mid-ocean vents, or these ocean vents. On there's carbon compounds, iron, manganese, hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur, and other compounds that are used in various biological systems, including many bacteria and eukaryotes and archaea today. So here's some of those black smokers, and not only do you have bacteria and other things growing close to or even within sometimes those hot vents, you have very complex organisms, in this case some eukaryotic organisms, clams and things like that, living around those that feed on the bacteria, but also use some of the compounds from those black smokers and other hydrothermal vents. There have also been some studies done indicating that because there's a proton gradient across those mid-ocean vents from the cold water to the vent itself, that there is a possibility, at least, for the formation of ATP as one of the initial reactions, and they can be non-biological reactions, but you can get this proton gradient and the formation of ATP around these black smokers and other hydrothermal vents. So now from all of these different processes, you have a lot of water, there are amino acids to produce proteins and peptides, nucleic acid precursors, and many other building blocks that we know are used in biological systems today. Those were all present before there were any organisms on Earth. And it was only a small group of ones that were fortuitously selected by the first organisms that are now used in biological systems. So now we think that the origin was in the bottom of the oceans, and then when you look all around the world, then you see the opportunity for these organisms to evolve and adapt to many, many more environmental systems. So the land area today is 148 million square kilometers. The crust is 5 to 10 kilometers thick, and there are actually organisms living at least 5 kilometers into that crust. The ocean area is 361 million square kilometers. The volume is 1.3 billion cubic kilometers of water today. And then the atmosphere is a depth of 100 kilometers, and the volume is 4.2 billion kilometers cubed. So if you consider the size of an organism, then there are many, many opportunities to expand into new territories. For example, here's a plate of E. coli colonies, and in each one of those dots, those colonies, there are approximately 1 million individual cells. Now, if you take 1,000 of those colonies and put them into a little microfuge tube, that would be less than half full. And it would take more than 1 quadrillion times this amount to fill a volume of about 1 cubic kilometer. And then again, the approximate volume of the Earth's oceans is about 1.3 billion cubic kilometers. So that by the time you look at how many cells would fit into the ocean, you have to multiply all of these up, which is a huge number. So the amount of area and the volume that is available to each one of those cells is just unbelievably large. So there's a lot of opportunity for these cells, or any cells, to find a niche within the ocean, on the land, in the Earth's crust, in the atmosphere, to survive. So therefore, all I'm saying is early on Earth, there were many opportunities once life started for it to expand and expand throughout the oceans, especially at first, and then onto the land and into the atmosphere as well. So here are some other major influences of evolution and life on Earth, things that made it possible for life to develop and evolve on Earth. So one thing that influences life is whether it's in a habitable zone near whatever star it's near. So we're near the sun, right? So it has a certain temperature. There are hotter stars and there are colder stars. And the distance that a planet is from that star, depending on whether it's hot or cold, determines whether it's in a zone that is habitable by what we know as biological organisms. So the Earth is in what some people call the Goldilocks zone. That is, it's not too hot, not too cold, it's just right. So if you look at the positions of other planets, Mercury is much too close. It's very hot there. Venus is almost within the habitable zone, but its atmosphere precludes that, because its atmosphere is sort of a runaway greenhouse. That is, it's extremely hot on the surface, although up in the atmosphere, it's much more conducive to living things, to biology. Mars is a little further out. It's a little colder, but it certainly is in a position where things could survive, and they probably did billions of years ago, but then it lost its atmosphere, lost its water, and then became pretty much a desert. There may be water deep inside of Mars, so there may still be organisms living in the soil of Mars. Jupiter is much further away, and Jupiter is a gas giant. That is, it does have a core at the middle that's probably larger than the Earth, but then the rest is gas, and it's under high pressure, and it's more or less toxic to organisms that we know. However, the moons of Jupiter, some are icy moons that may have an ocean under the ice, sometimes 5 to 500 kilometers deep. But they may contain some biological molecules, as well as the possibility of life. Most likely some sort of bacteria or something similar to that. Further out are Saturn, and then Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto, and all of those also have moons that may or may not possibly harbor living organisms or just biological type molecules. Another aspect of the Earth that has made it possible for things to survive on the Earth is that the Earth has a molten core of iron that's spinning around that forms a magnetic field around the Earth. Mars may have had a similar magnetic field early on in its evolution, but that since has solidified, so it doesn't have a magnetic field anymore. And this means that on Mars, anyway, the solar winds can blow the atmosphere away. But on Earth, the magnetosphere, the magnetic field, pushes those charged particles away from the Earth. And some of them you can see in the auroras at the poles, because a few of them then can enter the Earth's atmosphere up there and cause green and blue colors depending on whether they're interacting with nitrogen or oxygen. But that protects the atmosphere so that we have an atmosphere, a substantial atmosphere around the Earth. Without the magnetosphere, that magnetic field around the Earth, there would be very little atmosphere around Earth. Another thing that protects biological molecules is the ozone layer, which is O3. So it absorbs UVA and UVB, more of the UVB than the UVA, but it absorbs a lot of the UV radiation that would otherwise damage DNA, proteins. There still is a substantial amount coming through, which is why you get a sunburn, which is an indication that you've damaged some of your some of the components of your cells, including the DNA. Up until 2.7 billion years ago, the ozone layer did not exist, so UV irradiation full on from the sun was coming through. So before that time, everything pretty much lived in water, and not many organisms lived on land, and if they did, they had to be buried in the soil or buried in the rock. Exposure to the UV directly by living on the land was lethal. And this is one reason that very early on Earth, everything was in the water. Almost everything was in the water. 99.9% of the organisms lived in the water. But starting about 2.7 billion years ago, some cyanobacteria gained a manganese center in their photosystem, which allowed them to produce oxygen in part of the reaction by splitting water, which yielded more electrons and protons and quite a bit of energy also. So in generating the oxygen, some of the oxygen was acted on by chemical reactions high in the atmosphere, which caused the formation of ozone. And so the ozone sort of migrated eventually to a certain level in the atmosphere. And this began blocking the UV rays. And so it's occasionally there's an ozone hole because the ozone can be damaged by chlorine and fluorine containing hydrocarbons in some propellants and refrigeration systems, etc. So without this ozone layer, then things would start dying on Earth because there would be so much damage to the DNA. Humans would, in times when the ozone layer thins, humans tend to get more and more skin cancers as well. Very early on Earth, that is 4.5 to about 4.3 billion years ago, there wasn't as much water, but about by 4.3 billion years ago, oceans had formed, and small little lighter rock areas of rock that floated to the top of the heavier rock in the crust, started popping up in that ocean. One of the first called supercontinents was Ur, and it was in the Archean from about 3.8 to 2.5 billion years ago. By the Proterozoic, 2.5 to 1 billion years ago, those regions would move around one to another. So the continents essentially were bits of the crust that were mobile. They were moving around, and they're still moving today. So in these two pictures, you can see that some of those land masses have moved around. Laurentia, which is essentially the northern part of North America, and Greenland has moved a bit, and some of the other land masses have moved much further in over the billion or so years from the Archean to the Proterozoic. And you can already see, even by 2.5 billion years, that they're at the poles and in the higher mountains, ice and snow have accumulated. But there were even larger ice events. One of the ones that's most documented is this one between about 6 and 800 million years ago, called the Snowball Earth period in Earth's history. Although there are other periods in here, these little blue eyes, where there were major glaciation events. Some of these older ones have been less well documented, but there is evidence for some of those also. So from time to time on Earth, there were times where things heated up globally, global warming events, and there were also times when the entire Earth cooled to a point where during the Snowball Earth, the ice covered the entire Earth, including the oceans, all the way to the equator and from pole to pole. So here's an artist's depiction of that. You can see down in the middle, the lower middle, in the middle of this period, this is essentially what the world looked like. So you can see parts of India here, and Asia, Europe, and it's completely covered with ice all the way to the equator. In the time course above, you can see that about 800 million years ago, the ice caps were extending further and further down towards the equator. By 700 to 600 million years ago, the ice covered the entire world. In fact, the ice at the equator was about a mile thick over the ocean. And then, for unknown reasons, possibly a large asteroid strike and or an increase in volcanic activity, which then would send up greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the Earth warmed up over a period of several million years. To a point where it was actually much warmer for a while than it is today. And during that period, during this snowball Earth time, most of the land masses were collected together in the southern hemisphere, and very little in the northern hemisphere. This may have had something to do with freezing over of the land masses and water and oceans, but that's unknown. But it is known that about 510 million years ago, this supercontinent started to break up, and then you get North America here, Siberia, and Gondwana land down here, another supercontinent. During the warming also, this was a time when the number of fossils that we find increased dramatically. The number of animal families is much larger than today. So there was what's called a Cambrian explosion in species. It may not have been an explosion precisely. I mean, it happened actually over millions of years. And part of it was due to organisms building hard shells around themselves, which fossilize very readily. And it was probably due to predation. So they were these species that survived could avoid predation by other animals by building hard shells around themselves. So during the Cambrian, Ordovician, and Silurian, the continents continued to move towards from south to north in general. So you have North America and other continents, moving northward, eventually finding their place in the northern hemisphere, and then other parts of this Gondwana land starting to break up into smaller units. So by 225 million years ago, you have Pangaea here with North and South America clearly outlined, and Africa and Europe. And then by 200 million years ago in the Triassic, when you first, sort of the middle portion of when dinosaurs evolved, Laurasia, which contains Laurentia, which is essentially parts of North America, and parts of Asia over here, and Gondwana is starting to break up down here. By 135 million years ago, then these continents are starting to split apart even further. And note that of the dinosaurs and other fossils that we can find back here 225 million years ago and even 200 million years ago, they could essentially cross from one continent to the other because they were still connected. And those kinds of distributions of ancient fossil organisms also indicate that these continents were once connected, and the distribution of those organisms is because they could move freely from one place to the other. Once they started breaking up in the Cretaceous, then they could no longer move from continent to continent unless they could swim. And so now you start getting localization of organisms from one continent to the other, and then presently you have a situation like this. There have been some changes where North America and South America were joined by this isthmus in Central America, joining the two continents, and that caused some organisms to be able to migrate from North America through Central America and South America, whereas before that time they couldn't do that. And the movement of those continents is known as plate tectonics. So each one of these continents exists on a plate that is moving. So North America and Asia and Europe are moving apart. South America and Africa are still moving apart. Eventually, millions and millions of years from now, North America will then be touching Asia. And if there are any animals still left over at that time, then they'll be able to migrate to places where they were never present before. So if we look at this circular phylogram again, starting 3.8 to about 4.2 billion years ago at the root here, and then you get this separation between bacteria and archaea approximately 3 billion years ago. Now you're into a time when you still have that Ur continent, and then moving further out on this ring, starting to get Gondwana land and Pangaea, things like that, larger continents. And it's way out here at the very tips where these organisms that are present today are, and that's when the continents that we see today were present. And so they're evolving at that time. Now, when the continents break apart, that changes the dynamics of those species. And when continents then rejoin at a different time, and then you get a mixing of species, that also causes changes in the dynamics of the whole community of organisms at that time. So here's another phylogram, and this one focuses more on the eukaryotes than the prokaryotes. The previous diagram was showing mainly bacteria, and then the branches of some of these other ones. Here we have a branching pattern that is more or less correct in terms of timing. So the root would be somewhere right here, and then you start getting bacteria 3.8 to 3.5 billion years ago, archaea about 3 billion years ago, and then about 2.5 billion years ago, somewhere in here, you have one branch of archaea joining with one or two species of bacteria to form the eukaryotes. And so you have these protists down here, including the excavata And then the Rhizaria, Chromista, and Alveolata have been sort of reorganized into the SAR group, Stramenopiles, Alveolata, and Rhizaria. And this other group down here is now called the Hecrobia, so there's a few changes in terminology. But for the most part, this group down here, stopping at the plants here, primarily single-celled organisms, unicellular organisms, some multicellular organisms, especially when you get up into the Stramenopiles, which would be up here where the Rhizaria are on this diagram. And then you start getting these other crown groups, including plants, which many are multicellular, amoeba, many are unicellular, but there are a lot of multicellular organisms as well. And then the opisthecons up here, including the animals and the fungi. And again, most of those are multicellular species. So down here on these branches, that probably is between about 4 billion years ago to about 2 billion years ago. And then you start getting these multicellular organisms starting up around 1 to 2 billion years ago, and then really expanding the number of multicellular organisms from about 1 billion years ago to the present. In terms of the longevity of each one of these major groups, bacteria have been on Earth starting about 4 billion or 3.8 billion years ago. So they've been around all that time, certain species of bacteria. Cyanobacteria have been, at least the oxygenic cyanobacteria, have been around for about 2.7 billion years. And the non-oxygenic or anoxygenic cyanobacteria probably were around all the way back to about 3.5 billion years ago. The first species of red algae appeared around 1.9 billion years ago, so they've been around a long time. Green algae about 1.2 billion years. Land plants about 400 million years. That's as long as they've been on Earth. Sharks, cartilaginous fish, around 400 to 500 million years. And then dinosaurs were around about for a total of 200 million years, although it was different in each of these cases. Of course, these were different species, but the group as a whole was around from about 200 million years ago to 65 million years ago. Hominids, including great apes, have been around for about 7 or 8 million years, and humans have been around for about 200,000 years. So a very short time, hardly even visible on this chart. So most of evolution happened long before humans were around to study evolution. So again, here's this chart. We're way out here at the end. There are dinosaurs and angiosperms here, gymnosperms here, and ferns, sharks, insects, and again, land plants first got established here. Animals first appeared here. The first multicellular eukaryotes, as I said, there is some evidence that they existed even back as far as 2 billion years ago. There's some disagreement here. Here's green algae, fungi, chloroplasts, and red algae, and glaucophytes. Eukaryotes first appear here. Oxygenic photosynthesis from cyanobacteria, although anoxygenic cyanobacteria probably existed all the way back here to about 3.5 billion years. And then ribosomes and ribozymes probably all the way back to about 4.1 billion. So there's some disagreement on that too, and all the way back to the formation of the solar system, the Earth, and the Moon. But also highlighted here are major meteor impacts. So very early on, there was something called the major bombardment. So a lot of things were striking the Earth. Still getting things striking the Earth now. About 40,000 tons of dust and things are accreting onto the Earth every year, so quite a bit. But these major bolide hits, including the one at 65 million years ago, which was about here, have greatly affected species on Earth. One major extinction was about 250 million years ago. It may have been from a bolide impact. It may have been from something else. But we know the 65 million year old impact caused the dinosaurs to go extinct, as well as about 75% of species on Earth. So the one that struck the Earth 65 million years ago was about 5 to 10 miles across. Struck at an incredible speed near the Yucatan Peninsula, and this caused immediate extinction of everything within hundreds or thousands of miles. It spewed up ash and cinders, debris all over the world, and started fires all over the world. Also, there was increased volcanism, which may have been caused by some of the fracturing of the rock at that time. And it also put up a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, because where it hit was limestone, and that's made up of calcium carbonate. So the carbon dioxide rose into the atmosphere, caused a greenhouse effect. So at first there was smoke and fires and probably not much to eat. So that's probably one cause for the mass extinction. Fungi actually did pretty well, because fungi usually eat or live on dead plant and animal material, and there was a lot of that around. So one of the organism groups that really did well right after that mass extinction, those were the fungi. They did quite well at that time. And also remember that these asteroids, meteorites, comets are carrying biological materials, and so early on they were absolutely vital to the establishment of life on Earth. So they have their pluses and minuses when they strike. So this is a well-known crater in Arizona, and so you can see the building and the parking lot down here. And this is about a mile across, this meteor strike. And it was caused by a rather small, relatively small asteroid that struck thousands of years ago. So you can see how these things are kind of raised in the center a bit. Some are raised a little more, and then raised around the rim from the impact of that bolide. And you can find craters all over the world. The one that killed the dinosaurs is this one here. There's one down here in South Africa that may have caused the mass extinction of about 250 million years ago. And then there are others scattered around the Earth. Of course, you don't see any in the ocean, but they also hit the ocean. And you see them concentrated here in Europe and certain places in the US. The reason that you find them concentrated in certain areas is this is where the scientists are that study these things. If you were to actually find all of the sites all around the world, they would be evenly distributed all over the world. But because the Earth, the vegetation covers many of them, and there aren't scientists there to study them, then you only see them concentrated around areas that are relatively easy to study. So here's a picture of the moon, and you see all of the craters on the moon. And the Earth would look similar to this if there were no vegetation, no oceans, and you were able to spot all of the locations of each one of those craters. So the Earth has been struck by even more meteors and comets than the moon has. It's just that they've been either covered up by oceans, or plate tectonics has erased some of those, and vegetation has covered many of them as well. One other thing that protects the Earth is the oxygen in the atmosphere. So because there is oxygen in the atmosphere, then many of the smaller bolides burn up. They are oxidized essentially before they strike the Earth. And again, some of the really major impacts that have struck the Earth have been recorded. And so we know many of the really large craters that have caused mass extinctions and or have been easy to spot. More are being spotted now by satellite and by LiDAR, which is like radar but using light. So there are other ways to find these now, and more of them have been found on Earth, especially in regions that are covered by vegetation and are very remote. So if we look at just the last 600 million years or so, the Phanerozoic era up on top here, you can see multicellular animals are arising here, marine invertebrates, expansion of animals with hard parts, so that this is this Cambrian explosion where there's a lot of predation, which causes these animals and other organisms to build shells around themselves so that they fossilize better, and then we can find them. And then we have fungi and fish. The land starts to be inhabited here by animals and plants here. So now there's a very protective ozone layer by this time, and these organisms can survive and come out and start colonizing the land. Insects, gymnosperms, reptiles originate here, eventually mammals and dinosaurs around 200 to 250 million years ago. And then flowering plants, but then here's this 65 million year ago event that killed the dinosaurs, and about 75% of species went extinct. Here at 250, also note that about 90% of species went extinct. Some theories point to a large bolide or asteroid strike in South Africa that caused that. Others say that it might have been a gamma ray burst from an exploding star. And so there are a couple different reasons that are possible. Occasionally there are certain stars that emit gamma rays in a beam. If that beam is pointed towards the Earth or pointed towards anywhere, it pretty much sterilizes or kills anything in its path. So this lower bar down here, graph, is of the Cenozoic era, and that's where you get the initial extinction, although you still have fungi and mammals surviving. Here are the first whales about 45 million years ago. All the mammalian families are then present here at about 25 million years ago. Here the hominids arise here about 7 million years ago, the genus Homo, arising about 3 million years ago, and then Homo sapiens first appeared around 200,000 years ago, and the beginning of human civilization started about 10 to 12,000 years ago. So bringing it down to a finer scale, Homo sapiens coexisted with several different species of Homo, including Neanderthalensis, Heidelbergensis, Homo erectus, and about 5 or 6 other species. But we were the only ones to eventually survive. And then you get these cave and rock paintings going back to about 40,000 years, and then human civilization really began around 10 to 12,000 years ago with the domestication of several types of grass, including wheat, rice, barley, and eventually maize. And humans started domesticating different types of animals, including dogs and goats, sheep, pigs, eventually cattle, horses, etc. And then we get way down here to the end of the Roman Empire, and then the printing press. And so I want to look at this in a little closer detail, starting from about the year 1600. And this is mainly to put things in perspective as far as when different aspects of evolution were discovered. So you have Jamestown, founded in the U.S. here. At the same time in China, they had dynasties going on. But and then people started classifying organisms here, and Van Leeuwenhoek invented his microscope. This was about this time Bach was writing music, and Beethoven here, and then Linnaeus developed the classification scheme, the genus and species that we use today. Here's Mozart, and then the Declaration of Independence is signed in the United States. And right here around 1800, Lamarck was publishing his ideas about evolution, and that's where the environment was causing changes in the organism that led to their survival, getting longer necks in the case of giraffes, etc. And then right about here, Darwin has his voyage, and Lyell describes prehistoric ages from rocks. So he was in geology, and Darwin was very much interested in that. Kelvin then estimates the age of the Earth, and he did it by measuring temperature at different depths in the Earth. Up to that time, people had assumed that the Earth was only a few thousand years old. Kelvin, his estimates said that wasn't the case, that it was millions and probably tens of millions of years old. He was off by, a couple of orders of magnitude, but it was primarily because he didn't know about radioactive decay, which also caused some heating of the Earth. And so now we know that the age of the Earth is about 4.55 billion years old rather than tens of millions of years old. But this was quite a surprise to people. And then here's 1859 when Origin of Species was published. And that's about the same time the U.S. was involved in the U.S. Civil War, which kind of puts things in perspective. And around the same time, Mendel was publishing his work on these heritable characters in pea plants. And so both evolutionary processes and natural selection, plus the initial parts of genetics, were being discovered right about the time of our Civil War in 1860 to 1865. So while Darwin's work got quite a bit of interest around the world, Mendel's publications kind of lingered until about 1900 when several scientists rediscovered his publication and then established the field of genetics. So here's World War I, then chromosomes, equal inheritance was discovered just after that. World War II, during that time it was discovered that genes were made of DNA. And then 1953, Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA. The genetic code was deciphered in the 1960s. The sequencing, the first organism, a phage or virus, was sequenced here. And then early in around 2003, the first draft of the human genome was determined. So this brings us out to the present. And so I wanted just to point out some of these things so you can kind of get a feel of when these things were discovered, and then going back into evolution and even into human civilization, how little time humans have really been on Earth, and a very short time, an extremely short time, that we've known much about the molecular aspects of evolution. And so I'll go on with this next time as well. The last thing I want to do in this video is to relate the whole history of the Earth as it would be on a 1-year time scale. And so here you have January, February, March, April, May. So going out, and we would be at the end of December here today, or in the last few seconds, actually. So this entire first part here, from January through October, encompasses the beginning of the Earth, the evolution of the bacteria and archaea, the evolution of the eukaryotes, and then finally multicellularity and the barely starting of colonization of the land. So everything's by that time was still all in the water, in the oceans primarily, and lakes. So then if we take November and December and extend those out so that we can see in a little more detail, in the early parts of November would be the snowball Earth, and that would last quite a while, for about a third to half of the month, where the entire Earth is covered in ice and snow. And then we go later into November to the beginning of December, where we have some animal species, a lot of plant species. The Carboniferous was where we have those huge forests that are then creating a lot of carbon, sequestering a lot of carbon, which we will later pull out of the earth as oil and hydrocarbon fossil fuels. So during those periods, then you also see organisms then appearing on land, a lot of colonization of the land by that time, including animals and land plants. And then you get things like ferns and sharks and insects and reptiles and gymnosperms arising in late November and early December. And then finally, in late December is the Mesozoic period, including the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. And this is essentially the age of dinosaurs that you have. And then at the end of the Cretaceous and the beginning of the Quaternary or Tertiary era, then you have that bolide hitting the Earth near Chicxulub and wiping out all of the dinosaurs. So this is happening right around December 25th on this time scale. So not a real happy day or days for dinosaurs and 75% of the species on Earth. And then we go into the final day here, December 31st, and you get the first hominids appearing at 9:30 in the morning. And the genus Homo appearing around 2:30 in the afternoon. And finally, Homo sapiens finally appears about 5 minutes before midnight. And then human civilization begins just about a minute before midnight. And so that shows you the sort of amount of time relative to the amount of time humans have been on Earth relative to the age of the Earth and all of the other things that have happened in evolution. Okay, so that's the first part of this major events in evolution, and the other parts will follow this. So thanks for listening today, and I will talk to you a bit later.